Welcome to JustWannaQuilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School, where we explore all kinds of things, stories about quilting, tools, field trips, maybe some famous quilters stop by, and, of course, a little bit of copyright thrown in just for fun. I'm Elizabeth Townsend-Guard, your host. I'm a law professor at Tulane University Law School. I also hold 2 fellowships right now, one at the Business School and one at the Newcomb Institute at Tulane, and I just want to quilt. So Heather Grant joins us today. She is from Strategic-Sewing-and-Quilting Summit. It's a nonprofit leadership summit dedicated to achieving customer growth in the sewing and quilting industry. And she talks to us about this new organization. I think it started in the fall, and what they're doing during this very interesting time we are living through.
My name's Heather Grant, and I'm from Austin, Texas.
Awesome. How's Austin right now?
It's good. I mean, it's been rainy, and it's not too... I think it's not like a hot spot or anything. So
yeah, it hasn't been. You guys have been kind of off the map in a good way.
Yeah, I'm not going to complain.
No, that's good. Yeah, we're in New Orleans, so we were like, a little too aware. Everyone was a little too aware of what was going on. So yeah, we're now in the background, which is really good. So the first question we ask everybody is, do you have a first memory of someone sewing or quilting in your life?
I don't have a first memory because it was always part of my life. Nice. I don't remember my mother not sewing. I don't remember my grandmother not sewing. So it's always been there.
Yeah. Interesting. And then tell us, you're the Strategic Sewing and Quilting Summit, right?
Yeah. So I used to work for the MQG, and when I worked there, I talked to a lot of different people in the industry at various events and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And one thing that I noticed is that depending who you talk to, everyone has a different opinion on what's good about the industry and what's great about the industry and what's bad about the industry. And depending where you were standing, sometimes you had similar perspectives of someone who had a similar business as you. And sometimes you had a very different perspective because you had a slightly different kind of business. So I'm talking like a fabric company versus a shop.
Yeah.
And so their problems in many ways, or their challenges, can be quite different. But at the end of the day, I kind of noticed that the one big thing that was the commonality between them is that there wasn't this kind of industry collaboration focused on growing the end consumer.
Yeah.
There's collaborative efforts to support designers and collaborative efforts to support shop owners, but there isn't one looking out for everyone. And this kind of idea that a rising tide will lift all boats.
Yeah.
And you can provide support to as many designers and shops, but at the end of the day, if the consumer isn't there, you're not going to be able to grow that, right? You really need to grow it at the base. And so I thought that just getting everyone in a room together to talk about industry level strategy and figuring out what's the strategic plan of the industry and write that plan. And then after that saying, okay, this is what the industry may need to invest, or the industry after that may say, this was a great exercise, but we're not going to invest. But at least we did it.
But you had the conversation, and that's where it has to start, is the conversation.
Yeah.
So when did this group begin? Let's start with that.
It started in September. So it started in
really, really recent.
Yeah, very recent. And so we're not even official yet for a number of reasons, thanks to COVID.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it started in September, and I, talked to people that I had been talking to for a long time, and I reached out to some new people too. And yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about. So I am a law professor, and I've been really doing immersive research in this field for a couple of years now, and so I hear a lot of different things. So I've heard this question of like, how do we grow? How do we keep getting new people? How do we this sort of, we have to have these conversations. So it's really interesting to see that your group is now doing this because, again, I kept hearing it from a number of places of like, we need to have more significant conversations. So I think that's really interesting that you've started this.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that, you can't get an entry level sewing machine worldwide. They're sold out because of COVID.
Right. Right.
So like this whole thing, like, how do we do it?
It's happening, right?
Yeah.
It's happening. Yeah.
So
it's remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah. How do we keep them coming back after masks? What are they going to sew next?
Now, right. There's a mask lull right now. So no one's really having to make masks. Now, it could happen that we continue to have to make them, but we don't know what this means. So, but everybody now has fabric and machines. So, let's get them. Now, we've interviewed a representative from Joanne and all kinds of other places. And it's really interesting to see how much this has been kind of a renaissance with sewing. Did that surprise you? I'm surprised by it, but I'm curious how your group and what your thoughts were, because you've put out stuff about COVID-19 on your website. I'm curious what your take is on all of this.
Well, I mean, in the first week, it really just seemed bad for the industry in many ways. But I mean, we did say, I talked to a lot of people who were like, well, I mean, if you're not going out, you're going to stay home and sew. And one thing that's interesting about our industry is that in periods of recession, people tend to pick up their sewing because they don't want to spend money going to a restaurant. They don't want to go out.
Or even buying clothing that they'd rather try to sort of, although we have cheap clothing now, but still that was, you hear all these stories again, like, why do they start sewing? Well, my mom used to make my clothes, right? So it was a time pre kind of fast fashion thing where people were very it was economical. I'm curious if that will continue now that they have sewing machines. They're like, well, why don't I try to make a skirt,
Well, I think the interesting thing about apparel is that I think the reasons why people sew apparel are because they've reached a point in their life where they're just not satisfied with the fit.
Yeah.
Like the 40-something woman doesn't like anything in the store. So she might dust off that sewing machine and start doing stuff herself. And then I think the growing thing is sustainability, right? This kind of this slow fashion movement that you see that is really common in the knitting side as well, but also that it's kind of like, I'm not going to fast fashion. I'm going to make my own clothes. I'm going to cut out that entire supply chain of people who are not paid well and all of those container ships going back and forth all over the world. So it becomes a little bit of an environmental issue as well, which is something that younger generations are becoming much more aware of.
Yeah. And then you've also got the cosplay and the kids that want to sort of make their own weirdness, and they're not finding it in the store, so they want to do that too.
Yeah, cosplay is a whole other thing that is very, very little served by parts of our industry that I think could serve it better. I think it's because it's and the other thing that's really interesting about cosplay is that, they might be in their 20s now, but they're going to be the future quilter. So it makes sense to capture them as a customer early than try to,
and you've got people like me, which I had to make a bunch of cosplay stuff for my kids. As soon as she sort of got into so it was like, oh, I don't know how to put a sleeve in, right? Oh no. So you've got the quilters that suddenly have kids or grandkids that they're like, oh, I have to make stuff for. So you've got that side of it too, which is really interesting, So I don't know. It's very interesting. Okay. So I have more questions for you. So I'm on your vision and mission statement, right?
Yeah.
And your mission statement is to have a strategic plan to promote education and promote, understand, and educate and support the end customer. How are you going about writing a strategic plan? So tell us a little bit about that's all these different groups, all these different companies coming together to have a common vision of the future. Sounds a little bit challenging.
Oh, it completely is. It's not an easy topic, and everyone's got a different voice, and everyone has a different opinion on where they think things should go and how they think it should be done. But so that's the thing, is how do you get all these different voices in? And I think roundtables is the part of it that we're going to do. So you get roundtables, and you have cross-functional roundtables where you'll have a shop owner and maybe like a sewing machine manufacturer, CEO or executive, and a fabric designer and a fabric CEO. So you get all levels of leadership in the industry, and talking at the same table, right? Because they all have different issues and problems, but and they'll have different successes too. I think it's also important to talk about the ways that we're successful, because that's just as important as our challenges.
Yeah.
And so by talking together, they get a prompt, a challenge, and they talk through possible solutions. And sometimes you'll hear someone be like, well, I have this great idea and I think we should roll out this program. But then it puts like so much stress onto the shops to do. And the shops are already overwhelmed. So you have to develop programs that don't say, oh yeah, this is a great idea, we'll do all this stuff and have all this stuff that the shop can do. And the shop is like, wait a minute.
We already do too much. That's right.
I already have my workshop planned for the year, and I have a limited buying budget, and so on and so forth. So
very interesting. And then how much? So the other thing that's been a bit controversy about you is that there's a pretty high. You have to have $100,000 in revenue to be part of it, right? And so I've heard that people are like, why did you do that? Why is it important to have what about the smaller people? Tell me why you all chose to do that. I'm curious.
Yeah, well, so the reason why we chose to do that is because we wanted to make sure that we had established businesses be part of it, that have been around and are successful. There are single sole proprietor businesses that are making that revenue, and they've been established for a number of years. And the reason why we did that is and it's not like there are going to be exceptions to that rule. So if someone feels like they are qualified and should be a part of it, I encourage them to reach out and email to me. But we wanted to have the leaders of the industry at the table. And so, part of successful businesses, the way that capitalism kind of defines it, is through revenue.
Revenue, that's right.
Yeah. And that isn't the only thing that we'll be considering. Like I said, there will be exceptions. But we had to have that. And the other reason, which I think is really important, is that, what's really interesting about sewing is that there's a high barrier to entry to start the hobby, but there's an incredibly low barrier to entry to start a business, right?
That's really interesting. Yeah.
All you need to do is get a pattern together and put it in a PDF and put it online, and boom, you're in business.
That's right.
And so while the, small pattern designer that has 2 or 3 patterns and might be bringing in $25,000 a year is really important to our business,
right?
There are so many of them it's like, if I opened it up to all companies, 80% of our attendees would be under $50,000 a year.
Oh, and really under, I would imagine, in like the $10,000 to $15,000, I would imagine. So it's so interesting because again, I'm an entrepreneurial professor and I'm also an intellectual property professor. So I've been looking at this at both hats. And what I think is so interesting about the group is that I would think the other component of having, because it's a strategic summit, it's a strategic sewing and quilting summit, is that you have to have the earning power and the reach to be able to implement whatever you guys want to do. So
that's the other thing too. This strategy session, at the end of the day, if we're going to develop programs, we want to make sure that the people who have a voice in it are willing to invest. And there are programs where we want voices that aren't strictly driven by money completely, but we're looking to grow the end consumer, and when you're looking to grow the end consumer, that's tied to money.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is really interesting about the industry is how much it is based on labor that is very much hobby labor. So it's, the quilter who puts a pattern into a magazine, or like that they're like small players that they may make a couple $1,000 to $10,000 a year, but they're very integral to the system. Like the whole system needs these small players, but it's built on that labor in really interesting ways. So, and now with the internet, as you said, anyone can start a business. So you get this kind of flood of all kinds of stuff that you wouldn't have had 10 years ago, right? So I think that's really interesting. I'm curious how you all are thinking about that relationship, because your consumer is also starting businesses, is also like making a pattern. Like the lines are not clear anymore of who is the consumer and who is the company, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there's two parts to that. One is that there's this culture, especially, of everyone's got to have a side hustle.
Yeah.
And this is a pretty good side hustle.
Yeah.
You can stay at home and you can do something you love.
Yeah.
And it's creative. I mean, it ticks all those boxes, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of like those integral people to the system, I think there are a number of professional designers who've been in the role for some time, who would like a higher level of recognition for the work that they do. And that designers do drive our business. And maybe we need to talk about, how professional designers bring something really unique to the table, and they should be compensated in that way, right?
Yeah.
Is there a way to take the things that designers learn in art school, like this whole idea of design thinking, how that kind of came out of art school and went into business? Right. Is there a way that, we can compensate those designers that are professionally trained in design and really put an effort into it? Right. And they hire a tech editor, and they hire and pay pattern testers. They don't ask people to do it for free. Like, well,
I mean, I think so. What you're saying is yes. I'm sorry to interrupt because I got too excited. I think what's really interesting about this. So we did a thing where so I'm super experimental. So we invited pattern makers to come to we had a Facebook group, and they came and they sent us patterns, and we sent them out and all of that. And what I saw with it, which was really interesting, and this wasn't across the board, but a lot of them were not that creative, not in a bad way. I'm not saying this negatively, but they didn't meet the requirements of creativity for copyright. So that's what I'm saying. So it's very general patterns. They were using EQ software.
I'm sorry, I lost you. They didn't meet the...
So for copyright, they didn't meet like the standard of copyrightability. Like there wasn't enough creativity or interest. Like it wasn't enough to get copyright on a lot of the patterns. They were very simple patterns. They were mostly made in EQ, right? And there was kind of not a standard or a level of sort of what the instructions should be, how it should be tested, like all these things that sort of make a standard of an industry standard, which I thought was really interesting. And I'm wondering if a group like yours or others could help in that, in the sense that there are so many out there that don't even know like what they should be doing or how they should be doing. And like, even EQs, so many people are using the electric quilt software, and they're not supposed to be, right? Like that's not what the software actually says. You're not allowed to do that, but they'll just go in, make a super simple pattern, post it, make it into a pattern. And that just floods the market with kind of a lot of general stuff that really wouldn't have been out there if the tools of the internet weren't there to make it so easy,
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a need here. What I would call a professionalization of pattern designers, and the thing is that I don't think that we would be necessarily doing anything that professional pattern designers aren't already doing, right? Yeah. But the thing is that we establish a standard, and we help educate the consumer on this standard and why it's important, and why this pattern costs more, and why this pattern, you're going to have the right amount of fabric. Right. You're going to, there might be a mistake, but hopefully there won't be, like really kind of like put that seal of approval. And if it's and that's the idea, is to run a certification program. Yeah. And if a pattern is certified and passes the criteria, the pattern designer is permitted to put some kind of
certified by whatever. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think
whatever
that's
that
super
winds
great.
up being.
Yeah.
And it would be, that criteria is not going to be me, right? Because I'm
Yeah.
not going to determine what that is because I'm not a pattern designer.
Right.
But what I want to do is work and how things are between garments and bags and quilts are all going to be probably a little different.
Yeah.
But work with pattern designers in developing those standards and what they
That
think
sounds great.
is good.
And when you're doing that, do you think about, I'm happy to help, but the copyright side of it is super important. And we see under protection, like they're not registering their works and are not putting proper copyright notices on. But we also see over protection in this crazy way. So having that as part of the certification process, understanding like when they have copyright, when they don't, and what copyright means exactly is super important, because that's like that's the law that protects them. But they're very unaware, and they say really crazy things that are like could get them in trouble. That it's copyright misuse, what they're putting on their patterns that is not good. So I think the legal education for pattern makers especially would be really important.
That would be
as
fantastic.
Part of it. Yeah.
I would love to have you involved, because
Yeah,
I had never really thought about that. And that's the thing, like you start talking to different people,
yeah,
and you always get a different perspective, and it's hard because there's so many great people to talk to, and you have to distill so many perspectives.
I know you've got a hard job, but I think like if your job turns into anything like, so we've interviewed over 300 people in the last 2.5 years, and you start to get it. You know what I mean? You already know. But like as you start to hear these voices, the voices are so interesting that you start to see, oh, I get what this is. You know what I mean? Like you've probably already done that already. But that's what's so beautiful about having conversations and sort of talking to so many people.
There's really definitely a tremendous frustration with people whose sole income is pattern writing on the level of professionalism for the market, right? Like they recognize their peers who are professional pattern writers, and but it's the flood of the hobbyist, which I don't think there's anything wrong with hobbyists.
No, and the flood of free, they really get upset with the fabric companies flooding it with really generic free patterns too, which I'm not sure how you do, because they're trying to sell their fabric. So maybe you pair with someone super famous that's a pattern maker, like you recognize, I don't know how you do it, but they get it from both sides, I think, Yeah,
I mean that is something I've heard before, like the fabric companies, they buy these patterns at no cost or low cost and that sort of thing. The thing that's interesting about that is that I think that change will really need to happen either through consumer knowledge, but I don't think that's where it would happen. I think what would happen, the more likely scenario to get that change is that an innovative marketer will start working for a fabric company and change stuff up, and everyone will see that and then copy them.
Yeah, right. It's got to be, it's kind of market driven of like, that's the cool thing.
It is. And it's been something they've done for so long, I mean, you do want to sew up the product, but I think like when you think of, so I come from the tech world, and, we talked a lot about ecosystems. And we have ecosystems in this industry, but nobody talks about it.
And
right?
nobody defines it. I mean, Cheryl Sloboda and I once did a very early on when I was trying to understand what is this thing that I've stumbled into. We sort of tried to map it, but it feels like there needs to be a mapping. It's a really weird terrain, I think, don't you? Like there's a lot going on.
Well, the thing is that what I'm thinking is that, you don't have to, right? Like you don't have to have a Windows ecosystem to run the product, right? Like that kind of software ecosystem is not necessarily an apples to apples, but it's more of like strategic partnerships, right? Because you cannot sew a single thing without a minimum of 3 brands. You need a sewing machine, thread, and fabric. That's a minimum.
Right.
Well, and that's not including tools, right? Those are also brands.
Right.
So is there a way that companies can work together to kind of create their own product-based strategic ecosystem? That doesn't mean that, but when you market your stuff, you're marketing it with this whole other group, and you all put your power behind it. And then, instead of a, $25,000 marketing budget for the year, you're working with $150,000 marketing budget for the year because you're working with these other companies.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I've always been surprised at how like almost in their own little teeny tiny silos. I mean, there's companies that are partnering, don't get me wrong, but like I look at like each individual little small business is working and getting affiliates and like all these things, and I was always surprised that it wasn't more national and not like more focused brands, you know, like there wasn't more bigger things. It surprises me. Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think brands were necessarily huge in this industry, you know, in the 80s and 90s. You know, it wasn't until like you know, that kind there were a few people too though, but there were people in the early times like Mary Fonz and Liz Porter and Jean Wells and Darlene Zimmerman, like the people who were there like real early on. They had brands, but
strong brands, right? They became strong because there was a vacuum of no brands.
Yeah, or they're just, you know, there were people that were around. The history is something I'm always learning. I don't claim to be an expert there, so don't quote me on it.
Well, it's all very, it'll be interesting to see how you all develop as a leadership entity, because it seems like you've got your core people and then you're going to be thinking about all these problems on multiple levels. You have to, because there are the hobbyists and the micro entrepreneurs and the, you know, the internet sensation and the weirdness. Like there's just a lot of weirdness in this, in any industry, but it's
such a strange industry. The other thing that's really interesting that we haven't talked about is that it's a mature industry, right? The average age is 64. And so marketers have been marketing to that age. And so the disruption, well, there's been a little bit of disruption in our industry with the internet. Like the big market disruption hasn't happened like in other industries because that bulk of consumer hasn't fully arrived.
Well, and it's such a great, like, I mean, right. So it's, you know, it's empty nesters that often have disposable income. So like, how could you, you know, like when they're like, I mean, look at the long arm industry, right? We're a dealer. We're now a dealer of long arms, and so we're seeing it from inside, in the inside, and people are willing to spend. They have the money to spend it, you know, because their kids are through college, or they're, you know, empty nesters, or they didn't have kids, and they've got it. So it's really,
and that's one of the last generations with that kind of wealth. You know, every generation under them is poorer than their parents. You know, are they going to come in and have the money? Or are they going to be working? Like, I don't know. Like, you know, I mean, it's
well, and the thing that's so interesting too. So this is, I'm having a really fun time with you. So let me tease this out.
I like talking about
you kind of need the hobbyist to want to be an entrepreneur and be a business person, because we see with the long arms that they're buying it because they want to buy it, but they also are like, well, I'm going to retire and maybe I can do some quilting, or maybe I can make some pantographs. Like they kind of like, to justify spending the money, you also have to encourage and help them be kind of micro entrepreneurs. So it's a really interesting thing of like, you can't be like, oh, well, you're not a professional, so you can't do it. Like that's a really stupid way to go about it. It's like, yes, you're a hobbyist that wants to be a micro entrepreneur. Let's help you figure out how to do that, right? So I think it's really interesting. I think it's a very interesting industry, you know?
Well, we sell aspiration, right? Like you don't we say inspiration, but it's really aspiration. Like what do you want to be? Like what kind of quilter do you want to be? You know, like what kind of sewist do you want to be? Like, and then how does that define you? Like, you know, I make all my own clothes, you know, I'm a slow fashion person.
I make 100 charity quilts a year. I'm like, it's so interesting. I was thinking about this. I've been binding. So I have 25 quilts that need binding. Can you tell I don't like to bind? And then I have another 25 that have to be quilted. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm just going to bind. And now I'm like binding obsessed. But I was thinking about like, I'm posting images of it every time I finish of these. And mostly because I'm like determined that I'm not going to be embarrassed by what I'm doing. I'm just going to get it out there. But I thought about that in terms of like, I don't think that quilting has ever been a private thing. I think it has always been sharing it either with your family or in your group, or showing it up at a state fair, or like it isn't a journal. It isn't private. It is a very much of like, so the aspirational part that you're talking about is really part of that, I think, in really interesting ways. That and we're not sewing for our private weirdness. I mean, I was for like 2 years. I was like, nobody's going to see any of this. But that's not normal, is all I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think they're like quilters are probably more public in their sewing than like a garment sewist, right? Like,
right.
That's more of a personal thing. Whereas a quilt, I probably can't, you probably can't name one quilter who's only made quilts for themselves.
Right.
Really, you hear quilters who are like, I still don't have any quilts on my own bed yet.
Right, exactly. And then the cosplay people are on the other side of it, the spectrum of like, they're doing everything to be presentational. Like 100%, every single thing is about like showing the world that they are doing X, which is so interesting,
external. Yeah.
Right. Super external. Like, yeah.
But that's the thing about sewing is that, when you make something, and I don't think it's just sewing, it's when you make anything, there's an immense satisfaction when someone who is not you says, I like what you made. Totally. Right.
Yeah.
I really think that really comes down to like one of our most basic human needs, right? Because if you think about who we were before, in the hunting and gathering world, like the most popular hobbies are centered around many of our basic needs, like, right, sport is that kind of need for violence and war. Like, the arena is just a formalized version of war. And, cooking is something we had to do, but then it's become this whole thing where you eat with people and you go out with people, and there's a million cooking shows and a million cookbooks and everything around it. And then one is just like, what I call like fitness, which is like running or just being active, doing something physical, which is something we need to do. And the last thing is the things we would make. And we would make things for our home, to make a beautiful home or to make our lives easier, right? Those were the two things, right. Beauty or function. And quilts do both. And all of craft really falls into beauty and function, right? Because fine art is just beauty. Yeah. I think it can be both, right? It can just be beautiful and not be functional, but it's just interesting to me that it really scratches that base level itch of the human.
Yeah,
right?
It's very interesting, isn't it? Well, and we've seen this like, I don't know, the whole COVID-19 thing has been so interesting because we shifted to be like, okay, well, people were asking us to make masks. I was a super masker. So people were asking, we made them. We dropped everything. We made them. We used our own fabric. We used our labor. It was exhausting and emotionally huge toll. And we did it. And we did it for 3 months. And now everybody's kind of in a lull. But that was a very different kind of sewing than, say, making a quilt or making a garment, or like, it was really different, I think. So I'm curious what your thoughts are about that,
Yeah, I think it was very different. Like, and I think it kind of depended on people, right? Like some people I know made like so many masks. Yeah. It was just, you felt like you could help.
Right.
Personally, I probably only made like 40 or 50.
Right.
And I made them for the people I knew in my life, right?
Right. It was so interesting, wasn't it? And when you were giving them out, it was a little bit like the quilts, but in a more dramatic way of like, we sent them to friends and family and anyone who asked, plus we did local groups, like local medical groups, and it was a way to connect to people that you hadn't connected with before, or to say like it was so amazing to like make a mask here and then have my aunt or my cousin or my friend from college wearing it in a city in Hawaii or New York or wherever they were.
Yeah.
It was very powerful,
Yeah, but it's like there's also that kind of I think there's that emotional component. Like, how crazy is it that I'm doing this?
Right.
Like,
how not, like, this is not right. Like, we should not be, like, no one's life should depend on me making a mask, is all I'm saying.
And to me, it felt a little, it did not bring me joy, like it was something I needed to do, but I didn't want to. And so I call that type of sewing chore sewing, like hemming pants and making curtains.
Right.
And normally I don't chore sew. Like my husband's like, hem my pants. I'm like, there's a tailor down the street.
Yeah.
You know? But this is chore sewing I actually did because there was nowhere else to get it, right?
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I sewed all those masks, but I didn't enjoy it. I think some people did, and I think that's amazing that they did, and I wish I was them.
Yeah.
But to me, it was just like, this sucks.
Yeah. I think
on many different ways, just because it's boring sewing and because it's the situation and you know, like, I mean, a good friend of mine works for school in a Title I school, and they were, you know, these schools were, she runs the food program for a few different schools in this one district. Mm-hmm. And she was she was working nonstop delivering these meals to low-income families. Mm-hmm. Well, not delivering, the families would come to the school. And, you know, she's managing all these people. And she was like, I can't get masks for my employees. And she was just so at the end of her rope. And I was like, I'll make you some, you know, because she didn't have anywhere else to go. But like, how much does that suck that I have to make masks for, you know, people just to give food to people? Like, that sucks. That
totally sucks. It just, the whole world, it was just kind of scary and weird and strange, right?
Yeah.
And we're not out of it, but we're pretending like we are, you know?
Yeah. So, well, we'll see. I guess, I feel like this whole thing is like, well, let's see what happens in 2 weeks.
Well, I also think for the industry, what's so interesting is that we've all used up a lot. We feel like we haven't used up our stashes. Don't get me wrong. We have plenty left, but we feel like we have, and we should be buying stuff. So it'll be really interesting to see if there is an uptick in, like, I deserve to buy more fabric as we head into the summer and fall.
Well, that's the big question, right? Because I mean, I definitely, but when I made masks, I used the fabric that I knew I would never make a quilt out of.
Yeah.
So are we going to buy or not? And then, like, and is it one of these things where are they going to have the funds to buy? Like, they want to buy, but they've been laid off.
Yeah.
Like, it's very interesting. And a lot of things are back ordered, like basics, like black fabric and white fabric.
Navy,
black thread.
Right?
Yeah.
Navy's like impossible to find, I've heard. Yeah.
Yeah, and like, I mean, I was trying to finish this quilt, and I ordered this very pale purple fabric, and it was back ordered, and the woman emailed me. I was like, I have this other purple fabric I can send you, and I was like, no, I actually need it to match. I'm actually making a quilt.
Funny. Interesting. Yeah. Well, I just think this is I can't wait to see what your group does. You were supposed to have a session in Chicago
this summer, this fall, but it's obviously on hold.
Yeah,
like the world.
Well, I'm really curious. I'm keeping my eye on y'all because I'm really curious to see what happens, and I would love for you to come back and chat with us as you continue to grow and keep us posted on how this works. I think it's really interesting and really needed. So I'm really curious to see what happens.
Yeah, we posted that report on our website, so quiltsummit.org, about sewing industry perspectives, and we're going to do a follow-up in mid-June on that report.
Very
so
cool.
that will probably be published in July.
Yeah, come back and chat with us. Just sign up or just email me and let me know. This is awesome. Hold on, you're cool with us posting this? This is okay?
Yeah, it's totally fine.
Awesome. Okay, hold on. I'm going to turn off one recording. This has been awesome.
Thank you.
Hold on. So you've been listening to Just Wanna Quilt, a research podcast coming out of Tulane University Law School. And I'm Elizabeth Townsend Gard. If you like this podcast, keep listening. Also, we have a Facebook group. Come join us. We talk about a lot of things. We also have an Instagram account. And of course, most importantly, I really hope you get a chance to quilt today.